My father, when he was a little boy, being brought up in Auckland, from the time he was about 6 onwards, they were having to take him down to, I forget the name of the airfield, but it's now what is Auckland International. So they were having to take him down, and then latterly, when they couldn't be bothered to do it anymore, he earned enough money to buy a bike, and he would bike down there and spend hours and hours. Yes, so that was what he wanted to do. Once the Americans had joined the war, there were a lot of Americans based there because of Australia and the exposure it had to the Japanese theatre and so on. And in addition, obviously, we sent countless New Zealanders, in the Commonwealth sent countless New Zealanders to fight, most of them volunteering in the early stages, obviously, before it became a draft. There were New Zealanders flying in the Battle of Britain, and they were in the Army and the Royal Navy, and so they were fully participating both in our own armed forces and their armed forces in their own right because of the Japanese theatre of war. And it was patently obvious that he wanted to be a fighter pilot because that's the elite. If you want to fly, you want to be the elite. So it was fighters for him. There are stories that he was really quite cross, which is understandable. When the war ended, he was just 17, and he was very frustrated because he thought his chance was coming. He was getting close to actually being allowed to do what he wanted to do. His mother didn't want him to fly because she thought it was dangerous, and she thought it was perfectly acceptable for him to go off and learn about the printing trade. She thought that would be the better bet. And so he very quietly, having had his application to the Royal New Zealand Air Force stymied by his mother, he quietly worked for about 18 months in a print workshop, earning money to get over to the UK. And then he realised he could actually work his passage over to the UK to apply to the Royal Air Force. And that's exactly what he did. He found a boat, worked his passage over, got to the UK with £10 in his pocket, almost immediately blew half of it on flying, and applied to the Royal Air Force with all his fingers and thumbs crossed. They said, "You're going to have to wait. We're not ready to take anyone yet." And my father said, "Well, I've got no money, so please take me." And they brought him forward by 9 months. He wound up flying Meteors in Germany initially on 79 Squadron. Their unofficial motto was never above 100 feet because they were a fighter reconnaissance squadron. So they were sent out over terrain very, very low to see where the tanks were, to see what was going on the ground. And bearing in mind, you're sandwiched between the end of the war and the nascent Cold War. And so everyone's on tenterhooks. One of the missions of the Royal Air Force, one of the clear objectives, was the continuing ongoing oppression of the local population. So low flying was encouraged because it was presumably frightening. I mean, it's not a great thing to have to admit, but that, it was encouraged because it kept people behaving well and kind of going, ooh, big scary aeroplanes, we better behave. And then of course you had the whole Cold War thing starting to nibble into the Eastern German borders and so on. So he had a fantastic time flying with 79 Squadron. And then latterly went on to a sort of a black sheep squadron, the Overseas Ferry Squadron, where you were commissioned to take aeroplanes to squadrons overseas or where we were deploying aircraft sails. So my father landed the first Hunter sail into India. And that was fantastic because he was autonomous. It was not flying in group missions. It was flying with one or two other guys, if indeed it was even flying with one or two other guys. It was just long range, interesting aeroplanes, never the same aeroplane twice in a row as far as I can tell. So he did that for a while and met my mother, briefly left the Air Force and thought, now that I'm married, we're going to go back to New Zealand to start up a family and do that, and took my brother, I wasn't born, took my brother over to New Zealand. And a year to the day that they had gone out through the Panama Canal, they were coming back through it the other way because there was no flying there that he wanted to do, and it was just, it was breaking him. It was just creasing him up. And then was posted as part of the whole qualified flying instructor, fighter instructor team to Gloucestershire at the Central Flying School, and was headhunted fairly quickly to be number 3 in 1965 in the first year of the Red Arrows. Year 2, they made him leader, and this is really where he made his public name, because the Arrows were new and exciting and Britain was bubbling with energy, and it was Jackie Stewart and all that sort of time, the Beatles, everything else. And Father actually became quite well known. He did his 3 years as leader, left, then something went, there was a bit of a squiggle on the Arrows, and he was asked back. So he did a 4th year, which no other team leader has ever done. So that took him up to the end of 1969. And then they sent him to a desk. He hated it, so he left. And pretty much at the moment he was leaving the Royal Air Force, he'd met someone called Adrian Swire, who then became Sir Adrian Swire of the Swire Group and Cathay Pacific and so on. And Adrian had just bought a Spitfire from the Battle of Britain Film Company, because they'd finished filming that film. And it was MH434. And in my father's logbook, February the 21st, 1970, there it is, MH434, he flew it for the first time. And so that relationship began. It was very clear immediately that because of the way my father flew and because of the way the Spitfire flies, it was a marriage made in heaven. And Adrian asked my father, along with another then very notable aviator called Neil Williams, if they would fly it at air shows for him, because he wasn't that kind of aviator. He wasn't an aerobatic display pilot. And so my father did a little bit of that. Neil Williams did a little bit of that. My father then wound up flying at Cathay Pacific, and so he was only able to come back for some of the big key events. But because they were the big key events, Biggin Hill Airfair was huge in those days, like Goodwood Revival now. It was the major. Everybody's going to go. There's going to be a flood of people going to South London. So he would always come back from Hong Kong for those kind of displays. And they became synonymous. And occasionally he would fly the aeroplane in formation with the Arrows or with some other such. And it all tied in to this beautiful mosaic of this fabulous aeroplane with this amazing aviator. Born out of that, because my father had gone to Hong Kong, he was sniffing around the Far East for wrecks. And my father found the wreck of an old Mustang. So that had been bought in the Philippines, brought back to Hong Kong, where the engineering company that looked after Cathay's aeroplanes started to put it back together again. So we had that. We had a couple of other little aeroplanes, something called a Pilatus, which was like a Swiss fighter trainer. From there, with the Mustang coming on, very sadly, Adrian decided that he had to sell the Spitfire because he simply wasn't getting any flying from it. And we had to try and find a way of making sure that it didn't disappear to America or overseas somewhere else, and that it stayed here, because it felt, the thing about MH434 is it is a very special Spitfire in as much as it has this amazing continuous flying history that so many other Spitfires simply don't have. From 1943 to the present day, there's a 1-year gap in the mid-50s where it didn't fly. Every other year of its life, it's flown. So we didn't want this aeroplane to go overseas. And my father felt quite strongly about it. So he got a pool of money together, some financial backers, and we managed to buy it at auction. And the Imperial War Museum very fabulously, kindly said, "Would you like to base your organisation here at Duxford?" We said, "Yes, please." And that was the birth, really, the proper birth of Old Flying Machine Company. It already existed, but it was the Spitfire being brought in that really kick-started the whole thing. When my brother was alive, we were a very, very large organisation indeed. And I think, not to make a mockery of other air forces anywhere in the world, but at one point, because we had a lot of Hunter jets that we had bought from Switzerland, we were deemed to be larger than, in terms of Air Force capacity, we were deemed to be larger than, well, I think we were registered as about, if we had been an Air Force, we'd have been 19th in the world in size. So we had a lot of airplanes at one point. It was frenetic and busy. We were buying and selling, we were overhauling, restoring, we were doing a lot of film work because of my brother. And then round about 97, Mark was approached by a watch company looking to sponsor the aeroplanes, and those talks went on until at the beginning of '99 we basically launched Breitling fighters, which was an amazing platform for 4 or 5 of our fighter aircraft to be flying in formation. Quite an interesting thing for anybody to do. It's been replicated since, but no one was doing it at the time. Bearing in mind different engines, different airframes, so all those little idiosyncrasies that means the formation piloting has to be absolutely precision flying. And with the background we had and the pilots that were flying for us, because we have wonderful pilots, I mean, who all, we seek for them to fly. We like our pilots to fly in the manner that my father and Mark would have flown. So, that's what we look for. So fabulous formation flying, and that went on all through '99. It was 5 years, so it ended in 2004. At the end of the first year, my brother lost his life flying in our, I call it a 109J because that's what my brother called it, but the rivet counters call them bouchons because it's a Spanish variant of an ME-109. And but Breitling were amazing, and my father, having sort of had a fairly understandably a thought that that's it, thought no, actually let's press on, and so we went on until 2004 with Breitling, which was amazing. And I might add, all during this time, from the very get-go in 1998, when Mark was approached by Goodwood to take the flying aeroplanes to Goodwood, MH434 has been at Goodwood. So since 1998, and that, of course, was the year that Father flew down the start, to everyone's surprise. I mean, it was semi-planned. People knew it was going to happen. I just don't think people understood his capacity for low flying. So, Father at that point was in his mid-70s, and I think he felt it was time to start, with Breitling going, it was time to start winding it all up a little bit. And so he began selling a couple of aeroplanes and so on, and contracting. And then once he had passed, I had a good long hard look at it, and I knew we could keep going with MH434 and the way we fly. I knew that was more than enough, because the way we fly is good and the way we organise is good, and the way we pick people to fly with us. We have such an overarching view of the aviation world that we know who's going to work with us and who isn't, and therefore we can deliver on flying in a certain way, which hopefully is what we do for Goodwood still. So everything had to go except for the Spitfire. I couldn't bring myself to let the Spitfire go. It's in my bone marrow.
So I grew up watching Ray and Mark fly, and to say they had an influence on what I do and how I fly now would be an understatement. They are pivotal in how I operate, fly aeroplanes of this ilk.
He was a quiet character, but superlative professional, and I've just had the privilege, I've never looked through his logbook until today actually, and the logbook is an absolute artifact. It's unbelievable. So nobody could have come from such a perfect background to do air display flying. There's every imaginable aeroplane in there, and of course lots of time on the Nat, and leading the Red Arrows, which there's not many people that have a logbook that contains their leading of the Red Arrows flying, so just an amazing character, but quite a quiet guy. Always had a mischievous glint in his eye, whether he was in an aeroplane or not, but not a big loud character, but a very understated character, and you knew if Ray Hanna was in the room, you knew it.